The context of this event was to present the importance and significance of the OCCRP to our delegates, to our clients, and ultimately to their staff as it's cascaded, about what the OCCRP do, what their position is in the fight against financial crime, moreover what's our position adjacent to them. And you know, we're positioning Thomson Reuters as the group, as a go-to answer company for financial crime issues.
I don't know much about global laundromats, so I was hoping to identify and find out more about that here.
In terms of global laundromats, I know, in essence, what's come up in the press and so on, but also from conversations with a number of clients in terms of when they've seen particular red flags.
It would be great to actually get some more in-depth information tonight. To listen to people who have been really delving into this kind of stuff, I think will be key just to give us that alternate view.
Welcome to Thomson Reuters, a very warm welcome to all of you. My name's David Craig, President of our Global Financial and Risk Business, and I welcome you to Canary Wharf today. This is the first time to attend what will be a series of events looking at one of the most serious challenges that I think society faces. We're here to talk about financial crime, and most importantly, the impact that it has on societies and the impact that financial crime has on individuals around the world. And we're here to talk about our collective and collaborative efforts to deter, to detect, defeat financial crime. We at Thomson Reuters invest a lot of time and effort and energy to fight that crime and help our clients fight that crime. We provide much of the information, the big data, the digital systems that help financial institutions and corporations around the world detect financial crime, slavery and fraud, and many of the things that we'll talk about today. One problem with financial crime is even the term is seen as victimless. It's easy for people to regard it as different to crimes like robbery or violence or rape, because it can be hard sometimes to identify who's the real victim of this money movement. If there are no bruises, no broken bones, then how bad can that be? But as we in the room know, the long supply chains involved in financial crime are far from victimless. At the end of these chains, there's suffering, there's destruction, there's devastation, there's death. The money laundering and corruption that we're trying to prevent does not just enrich a few people, it's linked to drug wars, it's linked to prostitution rings, it's linked to child and human trafficking, it's linked to propping up rogue regimes and despots who seek to suppress people and perpetrate suffering. And the murder yesterday of Daphne Caruana Galizia, an investigative journalist who exposed Malta's links to Panama Papers, is just a reminder of the risks that journalists and people who are trying to fight financial crime face in revealing corruption. The objective of this series of financial crime conversations is to better connect all of us with the impact of crime and remind us why we combat it. We are a long way from Mexico, for instance, but as we speak, drug trafficking continues to devastate communities, undermine the rule of law, where more than 200,000 people have been killed. Both the drugs and the money generated from the sale of drugs connects us to these communities, to their victims and their families. So we have to do what matters. And the financial crime images displayed in this room and in the auditorium here, they're Reuters photographs designed to assist you connect to the implications of financial crime. So I encourage you to look at them and understand the impact and the message that they give. In the meantime, I want to introduce you to a man who knows better than all of us the complexity of the supply chains of financial crime. We're privileged to be joined tonight by Paul Radu, Executive Director of the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, otherwise known as OCCRP. Paul is the recipient of multiple awards of his outstanding and often dangerous investigative journalism. And like many of our Reuters journalists, he is a man who goes the extra mile, sacrifices a lot, and takes personal risk to deliver the stories. There's nothing fake that you're going to see tonight. The OCCRP has been proactively investigating corruption and the laundering of proceeds of corruption for 10 years. It's a group of non-profit organizations, journalists, collaborating media organizations, and its goal is very simple. Its goal is to help the people of the world understand how organized crime and corruption resides in their countries and their governments. And in Paul's own words, our organization doesn't belong to any country, political philosophy, or set of beliefs, other than that all people should be allowed to choose their own governments and lead their own lives in safety, liberty, and opportunity. As financial crime compliance officers, you'll be familiar with the work, including the laundromats, most recently the Abazijani laundromat. Given the significance and importance of these investigations, as well as the global spread of laundering, we're determined to make a real opportunity to learn lessons here. The OCCRP has secured banking documents which provide evidence of money laundering supply chains which connect differing businesses, multiple countries, and all too often the same features, including both physical addresses and IP addresses. So we're very grateful for Paul being here tonight, who's taken time out of his assignment based in Mexico to join us this evening and to share with us the story of the laundromat, how it worked, and the lessons that we in this room can draw as we continue our commitment to fighting financial crime. This event is being filmed and live broadcast. After Paul has spoken, Reuters editor-in-large Axel Threlfall will join Paul on the stage for a dialogue before we open it up for you to questions too. I'm going to invite Paul up to the stage in just a moment, but first what I want to do is show a brief video that illustrates the challenges that we're facing. Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and thank you very much for this invitation. The film that you just saw, we published it in 2014, so a few years ago. And this was when we were investigating the Russian laundromat, which is probably one of the largest money laundering operation in the world. More than 20 billion US dollars laundered via one bank in Chisinau, one bank in Latvia, in Riga, Latvia, and 19 banks in Russia. But I'll give you a little bit of background of how we came to investigate this, what I dubbed the laundromats. I was actually struggling for a long time to find a term for what was going on for these money laundering setups. And it all started in about 2010, when I was actually based at Stanford University. I had a one-year fellowship there, so I had time to think. And I realized what was important to me back then was that I was investigating, so I'm investigating organized crime and corruption for the past 20 years. And while at Stanford, I realized that I was writing the same story over and over again. I was investigating the same thing. The same components, the same ingredients were always there. The crooked bank, the offshore companies, the proxies, the formation agents, it was always the same things. So what I did in 2010, together with my organization, is I decided to go about investigating the infrastructure that allows for all this money laundering, that allows for all this organized crime to do business as usual. So we started investigating, we started this project that I titled Offshore Crime Incorporated, and we started investigating what we called the criminal services industry, which would be groups of formation agents, of bankers, of accountants, of lawyers that were in the service of organized crime and corrupt politicians. Now, that project was quite successful. We, as a result of that, New Zealand shut down more than 1,700 companies that were used in large-scale money laundering. Many of those companies, New Zealand-based companies, most of them from Auckland, were setting up bank accounts in Latvia, in Riga, but also in other Baltic countries. So we managed to expose what was a turnkey solution, turnkey money laundering solution that was offered to the criminal groups of the world and to corrupt politicians. So after we published this story, what we did, which was novel for us at that time, is we attached a database to our offshore crime project, where we exposed lots of the companies involved in these money laundering operations, and some of them we did not quite cover in our articles. You know, articles and journalists are limited. I mean, we tell a story, and sometimes, you know, we document a story and we gather, you know, a folder that can have, you know, a few gigabytes of information inside of it, but in the end, the text that we produce, it's really tiny, it's nothing. So what we did with this project is we attached to it even names of companies that we found during our investigation, but we did not exploit in stories. So after publishing this, I got a phone call from a small-time businessman from Romania who told me, look, there's one company that you mentioned with your project. It's called Tormex Limited. It's a New Zealand-based company. And do you know what? This company robbed me of $500,000. They stole from me $500,000. And I was like, wow, this is strange. Because I mentioned Tormex Limited in our reporting because there was a Canadian intelligence report, which was public on the internet, on the Canadian intelligence website, mentioning that Tormex Limited was actually laundering money for the Sinaloa, which is one of the biggest drug cartels in Mexico. So I simply put that on our website. So this was strange, right? I mean, there were allegations of this company laundering money for the Sinaloas, and then this small-time businessman, you know, saying that it robbed him. So what happened was this. I met the businessman together with a colleague of mine, and he explained that he was importing all sorts of goods from Belarus and from Russia. These were mainly, you know, industrial tires for tractors and for these big industrial machines. And he was always using offshore bank accounts and offshore companies that were recommended to him by the people selling these out of Belarus and out of Russia. And he started business, small business first. He was wiring them, you know, $10,000, then $20,000, and then $50,000. And then he wanted to score bigger. And he sent them $500,000. And this time he didn't get his goods back. So he lost the money. As a result of this, he went to the court in Chisinau and he sued. He sued these guys. The police started a criminal investigation on this group of people that told him to send the money to this bank account, the bank account belonging to Tormex, the New Zealand company, but the bank account being in Riga. And the Moldovan police subpoenaed these banking records from Riga of Tormex Limited. Now, the police was just focused on that particular case, $500,000, that fraud instance. I got access to the court case in Chisinau, and what I saw there was 2 years' worth of transactions. I was, of course, much more interested in the Sinaloa's transactions, you know, than in the Romanian businessman's transactions. So for me, that was a gold mine. I mean, 2 years' worth of transactions, about $600 million worth of transactions in this single bank account. I looked at it. And what was interesting was that this is where we also started the investigation into the Magnitsky money. I suppose you're familiar with that case, with what is, you know, one of the biggest fraud cases in Russia, having lots of outcome in the world right now. So if I can have the first photo in the in my slide. Oh, actually from here. Okay. So what you see here right now is decrepit house that was situated in downtown Chisinau. And this was where one of the companies that received lots of money in this Tormex bank account and in other and that sent lots of money to other bank accounts was based. You can see here there's a small tree grown in front of the door, so it's obvious that there's no real company here, right? But this was the physical address of the company that was involved in wiring and in receiving quite a bit of money from the Magnitsky case. So what you see here is, a slice of the Magnitsky case. Money stolen from the Russian budget and going through all these layers of companies and bank accounts, each company with its bank account, and then some of it ending with this company called Bunicon Impex that is based where I just indicated. Now, this company, Bunicon Impex, is a local company from Chisinau, and it wired the money to a company based in Cyprus, which is called Prevezon Holdings, which is, again, on the news agenda because of the, you're probably familiar with the Trump meeting, Trump Tower meeting in New York between Jared Kushner and Trump's son and other people and the Russian lawyer. The Russian lawyer represented this company, Prevezon Holdings Limited. So there's always a political component, of this type of money laundering. So in this case, we had the money that went through this house, went through all this convoluted kind of network, and then ending up in the accounts that were held by this company, this Cyprus company, in the Swiss bank UBS. And then the money was actually invested in Manhattan, in real estate, high-end real estate in Manhattan that was seized as a result of our investigation. It's a long story there. Now, this was one of the first laundromats that we found. And when we analyzed the bank account of this company here in this house, what we found out was that the same company, the same bank account, was not just serving Russian criminals, was serving at the same time Vietnamese organized crime, was serving at the same time Ukrainian organized crime, Chinese organized crime, lots of criminal groups, Mexican cartels, drug cartels. So they were all using the same accounts, the same companies, the same type of setup. It was then that we realized that this is much bigger than what we saw at the first glance. And it was there when we realized that if you follow the money, but you only follow the documents, you won't get anywhere. You need to have physical presence in a place to realize that this company that shows on paper that is in good standing, it's actually a non-existent company. It's a bogus company. So this is what we do at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. We follow the money and we have the network because it takes a network to fight a network. Organized crime always acts globally, always acts in networks. And I'm talking about high level organized crime and corruption. Now, starting from the Magnitsky case, we got a glimpse into how organized crime operates. And we were very, very much focused on setups. So starting that moment, we followed the money quite thoroughly. And what we realized, 2 years after we exposed Tormex and the connections to the Mexican organized crime, was that something very weird is going on in Eastern Europe, especially in Ukraine and in Russia. And that was these court cases that you also saw referenced in our film, in our short film, where a few offshore companies would be involved in these debt swaps, and all this would be made on the back of these promissory notes. What you see here is one example. So this was deposed in a court in Chisinau. It certifies a debt of $580 million between two offshore type of companies. One of them being actually based here in London. You'll see that there are lots of misspellings, in these documents. Although, you'd say that a piece of paper that is worth $580 million should not have misspellings, right? Grammar errors and all sorts of stuff. So you see, this is actually a company from London which is called Goldbridge Limited. Goldbridge Trading Limited, and this company, was involved in this debt swap that was in the tune of 580 million. In all, a few of these promissory notes amount to the 20 plus billion US dollars that were actually laundered in the first Russian laundromat. On the back of the promissory notes, which was what the trick is, they always gave up the debt to a local citizen, local Ukrainian citizen, Russian citizen, Azeri citizens, as we saw in the latest Azerbaijani laundromat that I'll talk about in 2 minutes. So this was a trick in order to be able to use local court jurisdiction. So to be able to have judges certify these debts. And based on these pieces of paper, we had the first laundromat, which you can see in this infographic here, which basically allowed money from Russia to be siphoned out of the country and to end up in the European Union in Latvia, usually. Now, what happened after we exposed this scheme, we got all the records, we managed to get a few banking records, not many at that point, was that law enforcement in a few countries started their own investigations. And they were all, fired up about this, and they started working. They subpoenaed lots of banking records, and then they stopped. They stopped for a simple reason. Organized crime is global. Law enforcement is always national. There are a few law enforcement agencies that can go across borders, but that's also based only on national interest. So let's take the DEA, the American Drug Enforcement Administration, right? They operate globally, of course, but when you look at the scope of their investigations, they're always defending the American interests, US interests, which means that the part of the network that doesn't affect American interest is usually let loose. And this happens over and over again. It's the same with British law enforcement, it's the same with Romanian law enforcement, with any kind of law enforcement. And this is what criminals are using big time. This disconnect between the way they operate and they think and their creativity and the fact that law enforcement is always confined to borders. So after we exposed this, after law enforcement started the investigation, they realized they cannot advance at all in their work. So what they did was they turned back to us and they said, look guys, we can't work because the Russian law enforcement is not cooperating with us, and there was a simple reason why the Russian law enforcement was not cooperating. One of the main banks involved with the Russian laundromat, this bank wired more than 5 billion US dollars in the Russian laundromat, the Russian Land Bank, RZB, and one of the main board members was Igor Putin, the sole cousin of Mr. Vladimir Putin. So to give you a bit of a backstory to this was, for instance, the FSB sent 2 investigators to Ukraine, to Chisinau, to other countries, the same 2 people, we even got their passport copies. And these guys were gathering intelligence, or were gathering information from the local intelligence agencies and local law enforcement on everything that was gathered up to that point in the course of this investigation by the law enforcement in Ukraine and such. And they never returned with information. They promised a lot. They said, okay, we'll get this information, we'll go back to Moscow, we'll start our own investigation, and together we'll do great things. Well, the investigators in a few Eastern European countries tried calling the FSB. They were always referred to a different office and so on, and they got 0 from the FSB. Because, again, this level of corruption, this level of money laundering is not possible without a political component, which is what we saw in the case of the latest laundromat, which we published in September of this year. This is the Azerbaijani laundromat, where we saw the direct involvement of the Azerbaijani state in high-level money laundering. So unlike the Russians, the Azerbaijanis were careless. They attached names to banking transactions. They attached, birth dates that made it easier for us to check, who's behind a transaction and all that. So they were careless, and maybe they had this sense of impunity, because in Azerbaijan, there's the press is controlled by the government. journalists cannot really operate there. But the Azerbaijani laundromat was actually possible because we worked alongside and on secure channels with Azerbaijani journalists. I can only name Khadija Ismailova, who's my longtime friend and who's worked actively on this laundromat. And again, the idea is you can't, I mean, to be able to fight this type of laundromats, to be able to expose how they harm the people. Because, for instance, in the case of the Russian laundromat and the grand theft from Chisinau, 1 billion was stolen from 4 banks, in a tiny country. Now that left the people of the country without their pension fund. That made the IMF not to give loans anymore to the country, and so on. So there are many, many types of outcomes from this money laundering. And I think what we investigated as investigative reporters is tiny. I mean, we don't even see the whole game here. I'm pretty sure that criminals are much ahead of us, and I'm pretty sure that what we exposed is great. I'm very proud of this work, but it's peanuts. I think there's a lot more that's ongoing right now. And for this, we would need, a lot more help in order to expose the laundromats of the world. And we're now working on a new laundromat. There are many, many laundromats there. The amounts of money going through these systems are just staggering. And how I see this, in a graphics way, it's like these are the pumps that power, organized crime. This is, the money is the blood, and these are the pumps, the laundromats. These allow the legal financial systems of the world to be connected to organized crime. This allows organized crime to operate across borders. And as you mentioned earlier, we see right now that Daphne Caruana Galizia was killed, was murdered, right, in Malta. This is a result of that. I mean, Daphne was investigating the investments made by Azerbaijani elites into Malta and how they paid off Maltese officials. So this is, I mean, if this sort of stuff will continue, this is what's going to happen in other parts of the world. It's not just, poor countries from East Europe or Africa or elsewhere. It's everywhere, because in the end, by allowing the laundromats, the power of organized crime increases, and so does their sense of impunity. So I'll finish here, and yeah, we'll open up for questions and everything. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul.
Thank you.
Lots of questions from me. I'm going to kick us off for about 20 minutes, and then I'm sure you've got lots of questions for Paul as well, so we'll leave plenty of time for that. You mentioned that, I'm going to start with, with the news. You mentioned the tragic murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia. Her son, who you know well, Paul, has called Malta today a mafia state run by crooks, where institutions are incapacitated. Is he right, and was this a political assassination?
I think he's completely right. I mean, I know Matthew for quite some time, and he was one of the leaders of the effort to expose the Panama Papers scandal. He was working alongside the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and with us at OCCRP. And I think what's going on with Malta is that the country, the island itself, it became a hub for organized crime and for corrupt politicians from all over the world. It's what happened to Latvia, what happened to some extent here in England, and particularly in London, is when you allow organized crime to use your financial system, when you allow them to use your companies, when you allow them to hide behind your corporate structures, that's when you allow them to grow. And this is what happened with Malta for the past 10 years. There's secrecy in Malta when it comes to setting up companies. You can establish limited companies where you list proxies, and you don't list the real owners of those companies. And this system was used heavily. In many of our investigations in the past 10 years, we came across Maltese companies.
just as easy, of course, to set up companies in the UK, and I'm going to come to that in just a second. Just a quick follow-up on that, on the tragic news today. Will following the money, Paul, do you think help uncover who is behind this murder?
I believe is the only way. I mean, there's two distinct paths here. I mean, one is the criminal investigation. Maybe the police in Malta will find out who planted the bomb, you know, who physically, you know, did all this. But more important is, you know, to get down to who ordered it. This is, I mean, we're seeing this all over East Europe. We see people sent to jail because they killed journalists, because they killed lawyers, they killed, you know, lots of types of people. But those are not the real perpetrators of these crimes. You know, I mean, you look at very prominent cases of journalists, you know, getting killed in Moscow, and you see that there are a few Chechens sent to jail. You know, but those are simple executants. I mean, those are not the
You talk about the ease of setting up a company in Malta. The G7 nations are very, very good at castigating the Latvias, the Moldovas, the Azerbaijans for being the bad actors here. But the problem, surely, a big part of the problem lies here in the UK and it lies in the US. I believe your group has uncovered 20, 30 companies, registered addresses with companies, some 10 to 50,000 companies for each address, LLPs that are involved in this. The problem is surely right here on our doorstep.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Eastern Europe, there's a lot of crime there. And a lot of that crime comes here, you know. I mean, we're talking about pickpockets, trafficking in persons, all sorts of crimes. But when you look deeper, when you look at the money flows, you realize that something interesting is going on. You look at Eastern Europe and you see that the EU is sponsoring all these anti-corruption efforts. And this can be in the tune of a few $100 million annually. But then you see that from these Eastern European countries, there's like a hurricane of money. It's like a tsunami of money in the billions and billions that flow the other way. So what you expect to do is the EU to try to stem corruption in these tiny countries, corrupt countries, but then, in fact, the criminals from those countries deposit their money here.
Yeah.
And this is what.
Are you surprised by the prominence of the UK, for example, in your investigations?
I'm not, you know, I mean, I'm investigating, you know, organized crime and corruption for a long time, and in almost every prominent case I ran across UK-based companies, Scottish LPs, you know, LLPs based in London and elsewhere. So what you see when you look deeper into this, and when you look at the criminal services industry, you see that even people that used to set up companies in Cyprus, which is, you know, like a tax haven since communism, you know, since 60s, since the 70s, and you know, you see that they moved to the UK because this created for them the right conditions, you know, the right place to set up these sandwich companies, to use the Commonwealth, you know, to use other components of the UK.
You know, you talked in your opener about how constrained governments are given the law enforcement constraints. I want to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Have you ever lobbied the UK government and questioned why this has been permitted to go on unchecked for so long? I mean, you've been doing this for 10 years. It's getting more and more well-oiled, this laundry machine.
I mean, I talked quite often to representatives of the Bank of England, for instance, you know, or other people in the government. I was actually here 2 years ago at the invitation, right before Brexit, at the invitation of the PM then. And there was this big anti-corruption meeting, and I addressed, you know, the meeting of heads of states there, talking a bit about what's going on and the UK being central to all this money laundering and accepting all this criminal money. And it seemed like there was some movement. It seemed that something would happen, but then Brexit occurred, and I think that's kind of stopped, you know, those efforts.
Oh, that's our excuse now, is it?
I'm not sure, but I'm not seeing right now a lot of action, except for civil society, for TI UK, for instance. I think is doing a lot of good work along these lines. But when it comes, I mean, you know, when you look at someone who's in politics and who has a term like in office for 4 years or 5 years, and they have to accomplish certain things for their political party, for their political position and all this, and you see countries like Malta, for instance, selling golden visas, or Spain selling golden visas and attracting all this criminal money without asking questions, you know, you see that it's an unfair fight, because if you have the global interest in your mind, you know, you can't defend the state interest, you know. So there's all this.
Okay, so that's the government on one side. So you've spoken to the Bank of England. What about the company formation, the management agents of some of these companies in the UK? Are you chasing them? Is that part of your investigation?
Yeah.
And how hard is it to get to those people?
Well, we exposed quite a few of them. Some of them here in London. I was myself knocking on doors here in London, you know, these formation agents, and trying to talk to them. Some of them talked to me. Of course, they didn't reveal anything about their clients. But what was interesting was, at some point I was talking to the controller, to the state controller of Delaware. You know, there are lots of Delaware companies used in these schemes, and that person told us that, look, we cannot ruin a great system for a few rotten apples, and this is how many of these people think. I'm going every year, lately twice a year, to this offshore conference. It's a conference where there's formation agents from all over the place, from the Caribbean, from the UK, from everywhere, coming together and talking about what's news when it comes to offshore company formation and all. And talking to these people, including British formation agents, it's like they have this idea in their mind that they're just, you know, fulfilling a service. You know, they're not helping criminals. They're just setting up these structures. But, you know, when with the first project, when I investigated the infrastructure of this offshore industry, is we approached one formation agent that was based in Bucharest, and he was part of a larger network called the Taylor Network. And now this formation agent from Bucharest, he was operating across the world. We approached him telling him we are crooked businessmen trying to launder some money, trying to import some oil from Africa without paying taxes. He took a piece of paper, he designed the schemes that he would create for us. He invoiced us, you know, for these 2 sandwiched schemes, it was about $11,000. But then he asked for 1% of the business of each of these 2 businesses that we proposed him. So he was part in it, you know. Then we went undercover to meetings. I mean, like we have this this thing here. The formation agents, you know, organize seminars, organize workshops all over the place, from Kyiv to Moscow to everywhere, to, you know. And what they do is they present schemes, new schemes that they can apply for wealthy people to hide their wealth, to launder their money, and all this. This is ongoing right now. This is how they recruit their clients. I mean, they know what they're doing. They know what they are about. It's just that they shield themselves, I think, mentally, you know, by saying that, no, look, we are just, you know, the gun in these, you know, we're providing.
You know, I come back to the government, and I'm going to get back to your investigations in a second, really what you're looking out for here. But I come back to the governments, and, you know, I guess the point I'm making is, you know, clients of ours, you know, the banks and others are you know, forking out billions of dollars every year in this space, and the governments are not doing their part. You know, criminals don't respect borders, as you said, but the borders are going up all around the data, and we talk about privacy laws, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There doesn't seem to be a solution here. What is the solution? What's next for your group when you're reporting this stuff? How do we find solutions now? Because it's not going to come from the government.
Right. I think the approach must change. I mean, if you look at the Russian laundromat, these are more than 70,000 transactions. It's kind of impossible to follow 70,000 transactions. And again, I mean, this is 20 billion. There's a lot more, you know, money laundering out there. So how do you follow all these hundreds of thousands of transactions? That's, you know, impossible, because organized crime is fast. You know, these are very creative individuals that make, you know, country risk assessments, and they know exactly what's going on globally. They travel a lot. They're much smarter than a law enforcement officer who sits in an office, at all times, and doesn't have this world knowledge. So I think if you look at the Russian laundromat, the money came from 19 banks in Russia. They all gathered in one small bank in Chisinau, and then from there it went to one bank in the EU, and from there to many, many other banks in the EU and the US and China and elsewhere. So I think instead of going for the 70,000 transactions, what you can do is follow the bank. I mean, once a bank is able to inject $20 billion over a span of 2-3 years, in the world's banking system, I would like to know who owns that bank.
Well, these banks are owned by the bad actors, right?
Guess what? You won't be able to find out who owns that bank because there are LPs and SLPs that own the bank. And what happened was, again, these guys are creative and very smart. So the banks in Moldova involved in these large-scale frauds are majority owned by British companies, or they used to be owned by British companies up to 1 year ago, 2 years ago. And in Moldova, for instance, there's a threshold. Above 5%, you have to declare who's really the owner of the company owning shares in a bank, this ownership stuff. But then what happened was all these guys, the criminals, inserted their offshore companies with 4.9%. The authorities in the countries changed the law, said, no, they won't outsmart us. So they changed the law, and they put a threshold of 1%. Guess what happened next? It's obvious, right? Yeah. But for banks and for compliance people, instead of going for the hundreds of thousands of transactions, I would rather go for the bank. If I don't know who owns a bank, I don't know who's responsible for all this money, for all these transfers. So why not go to clean up, the ownership of banks? And those are not hundreds of thousands in the world, those are fewer.
And what about, again, as a journalist, an investigative journalist, looking at, it seems to me everyone's been quite reactive to this. We're not being predictive. We're not analyzing the data in a clever enough way, or at least more cleverly than the bad actors, or in a more creative way than the bad actors. What are you looking at as an organization when it comes to being more predictive, using AI, using big data, etc.?
Yeah, so as I mentioned when I started talking, I realized at some point that we were investigating over and over again the same schemes. Because crime to us is a thing that is imported and exported as a scheme across borders. So there's criminals that use this criminal method today in London. They will maybe be stopped by the law enforcement here in London, and they'll just move to other countries with the same criminal scheme. So what you can do, and what we do, for instance, at OCCRP, at my organization, is we follow patterns. We extract patterns from our older work or from indictments, or from various other sources, and we try to see, we match that against data sets. Sometimes I wouldn't say big data, but large data sets, in order to identify organized crime and corruption where we don't know that there is organized crime and corruption. So imagine you identify this pattern that, Belize companies are always used to set up British companies, for instance, Scottish LPs, and you always have these two Belize companies, as owners of the SLP. So now what I would do is I would look for all the instances where Belize companies with the same address in Belize City, would set up a company in the UK. So then, that would give us, the future of crime. So if we look for patterns, and if we use artificial intelligence and really simple algorithms, we can mix up these patterns, and we can see new patterns that are probably going to be used by organized crime in the future.
So are you doing that now?
We are.
And that's your strategy, is it?
Yes.
Because let's face it, 10 years on, it must be extremely frustrating. I mean, you've uncovered so much. The statistics are, quite incredible. What you've achieved, OCCRP, 4.2 billion in assets frozen, seized by governments, 55 criminal investigations, 25 calls for action, civil or international bodies, etc., etc., etc. But this well-oiled washing machine keeps turning.
Yeah, so actually those numbers are from last year.
So they look a lot better now.
Yeah. It's actually more than $7 billion US dollars that we contributed to recovering. We didn't recover them ourselves. This is the job of the law enforcement, of course. But our reporting ignited these cases, these law enforcement cases. So basically the return on investment, we have a tiny budget. Over the past 10 years, maybe it was $9 million US, 10 million. The return on investment is 57,000% about that. This is huge, right? I mean, drugs don't yield this type of investment. So really, I mean, if you think about it, and it's the only way to try to counter organized crime and to stop these guys from doing business as usual, because they have the smarts, they have the money, they have the global networks, you know. What do we have? You know, maybe less smarts, obviously less money, you know, a little bit of the network, but not as much as they do, you know, because they have all these connections. So I think, I mean, going tech is the way to stop them. And I'll give you one example, and this was very, very low tech in a way. I was just awaiting a colleague of mine to come from Chisinau. There's a very short flight between Chisinau and Iași, which is a town in the northern part of Romania. It's a short flight, and my colleague came out of the airport gates and told me, look, you wouldn't believe who I saw in the plane, in this tiny plane. There were 3 crooks that were all convicted for fraud, high-level fraud in Romania, and they were suddenly together coming from Chisinau. And we were wondering, what's going on there? This must be something. They must develop some business. And we started, you know, searching in databases, and we found out that they initiated a few businesses together with heads of the intelligence services in Ukraine and in other countries, and they were about to start business. What we did was we publicized this before they even started, saying, look, these are the guys. They put together all this infrastructure. They have not acted yet on it. But this was enough for the government of Moldova to not enter contracts with them, because they were about to enter a contract with the TV station, the main TV. It's a very long story. So I'm thinking, you know, we can give people's choices. We cannot, you know, stop crime from happening, you know, but we can give people more choices.
You know, one thing I want to, you know, there is so much I want to ask you and so much for us to talk about, but I've got to give it over to our audience and just to say, but I want to draw out just the scale of this and the devastation and help people understand this. It's something I was trying to get my head around. You know, it's one thing when we talk about the UK or other big countries, but the Moldovas, you know, when something like this happens and we're talking billions and billions of dollars, the country is affected, the citizens are affected, the people are affected, pensions are depleted. It's a devastating result, this.
It's huge, and people take to the streets and they want their billions back, you know, and they want their lives back basically, and their pensions, you know, they want to be able to live. But then there's another effect that is really, and it's very deep in the society. They start not trusting the anti-corruption efforts. They start trusting the criminals. Because the criminals, what they do is what happens all over the world. I'm seeing this in Mexico, and you know very well about it. It's they stole a lot and give a little back. And if you talk to a taxi driver in Chisinau or in my country in Romania or in Poland or everywhere, you'll hear the same words, saying that, look, the government is stealing, is a thief, but the government never gives us anything back. The criminals, they steal and they put something back in the society. They build a church. They give a donation there when there's a flood. But that's tiny compared with what they steal from the same people. But their PR and the ways that people really see the outcome of that, you know, it's so different from what the government does. So you're ruining all the anti-corruption efforts by allowing this to go on.
You know, we talk about Latvia, you know, a country, it seems to me, have wised up to this to a certain degree. You know, dollar transactions were affected so badly. We talk about Moldova, Azerbaijan. Where next? Where are you looking next? I mean, China, it came up in your speech at the top here. I mean, it's no necessarily great surprise, but how much of your focus is on China now?
I mean, when you look at the laundromats, at all the laundromats, including the latest one, the Azerbaijani laundromat, you see that a big percentage of the money goes to China. Both Hong Kong and there's actually 4 provinces in China that received a few billions that we managed to document in the past few years. This being dirty money from various criminal groups. So I think China is now, because China presents itself with a solid banking system for these guys. Because honestly, I mean, these guys, they don't want to put their money where they steal the money from. It's as simple, you know. This is why they use London, because they know that their money is secure here. This is why they invest here in real estate and in everything, because they want their investments to be solid. They want to operate across borders and to operate in because they make their money in environments where there's nothing solid, where everything is shaky, where the law enforcement is weak, where the government is weak and corruptible, and all this. So, but they like to. So, and China seems to be a new player, because China seems to be offering quite a solid banking system with great returns.
Can you tell us what you're doing in Mexico now?
No, I work on a few stories that I can't talk about, but mostly what I'm trying to do, I was based last year mostly in Colombia. So what I'm trying to do is to set up networks of investigative reporters and activists that are able to follow the money across borders. And what I do is I present them with data sets. So when I go into a country, what I do is I share with journalists, with local journalists there, look, this is all the citizens of your country that opened up bank accounts in, I don't know, Zurich, or that set up companies in this country or that country. So usually I introduce them to citizens of, for instance, Mexicans who opened up companies here in London, for instance, and then they can follow back. They can see if those companies are. This doesn't mean that all the British companies are involved in crooked stuff. No, I'm not saying that, of course. But it's always, what we do lots of times is we fish in databases for information, and it's always this difference between. You can have the overview, you can have access to databases, but you don't have the local knowledge. So for a local, seeing a database and being able to browse through that database can mean a lot, because information that's not very valuable here locally can be very valuable elsewhere. So we're playing quite a bit with geography. So we're extracting lots of data from database and then introducing this data to others.
Let's have some questions from the audience. Yeah, gentleman right here, and then we'll come to you. Go ahead. There's a mic roving. Tell us who you are and.
Martin, we were in touch about 10 years ago, actually. Hello. We were talking about, it was at the beginning of the, maybe 8 years ago, talking about movements of money from Eastern Europe, and we did also talk a few years afterwards about the Magnitsky case. I wanted to ask you what level of complicity you see from Western governments, because I was in Davos a couple of years ago, and I was talking to an asset manager about a new fund and asking what they were going to do to risk manage the potential for corrupt payments. It was a frontier markets fund, so the risk is there. And this little chap sidled up, and I was going to send him away. I thought he was a little kid, and he said, "I'm the Minister for Business and Energy in the UK, a guy called Matt Hancock." And I said, "What, facilitating it, or?" He said, he said he was basically corruption was part of his mandate. And asked him what he was doing about it, and I talked about limited liability partnerships, and he said, "No, it's only a small problem." I said, "Well, hold on. In the last year, we've had Sinaloa cartel, we've had a Nigerian governor, we've had various Uzbeks, etc., various people from Eastern Europe, including from the families."
They don't get it.
You know that this is happening. When are you going to have named owners on limited liability partnerships? He said, "Before the election, we will have run this through Parliament and we will do this." He said it 3 times in the same conversation. 3 times he said, "We will have named owners on these limited liability partnerships." Eventually they did, but the named owners could have been British Virgin Island companies who don't have named owners. So we're basically, so are they taking basically the proverbial rise?
Okay,
right.
Are they?
So I think governments are complicit in this, in the sense that they allow this to go on. They allow for, and they fail to implement transparency when it comes to companies. And I'm not just talking about the UK government. You can create companies, entities with the same level of secrecy in Austria and in many, many other countries. So, but I think you have 2 levels here. One is governments that are complicit in this, and the other one is we see this rise of the global organized crime, and this global organized crime is run by businessmen. These are businessmen that operate across many, many frontiers. And funny enough, these are the main people that now fund all these anti-globalization movements, because they want to operate at that level, without others being able to as well. And this is why, you see extremist parties in many countries that are sponsored by these same people that are global, that should be the first to be rooting for global. So I think you have many levels of complicity there, and then you have these people that act directly on this and that undermine democracy and democracies across the world and globalization and yeah.
Okay. Yeah, really quickly. Yeah.
I mentioned this, your laundromat. So I talked about your laundromat investigation in December last year at the anti-mafia conference in Florence, and basically asked where did this money go. And effectively, I want to get an opinion here on, we've seen financing of various extreme groups. The money, we don't know where it's come from, but there are several investigations that going across Europe into the financing behind a number of groups. I'm not going to mention them, but you know which they are. Yeah. What have you found? Have you found anything?
Well, I mean, the reality is that we know where the money comes from, where most of the money comes from. We don't know where most of the money went to. So in the Azerbaijani laundromat was easier. We found out that there were politicians paid with this money, that there were media people, journalists paid with this money, and all sorts of other people. In the Russian case, we know that this money was splashed all over the EU and the US, but we don't really know, who benefited from this money. We found, instances there and there. For instance, this extremist group in Poland receiving some money from the Russian laundromat, and they are anti-EU and pro-Russian and all. But these are tiny. I mean, but most of the money, honestly, we don't know where this money went.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, go ahead. We got a mic? Thanks.
Thank you, Duncan Hames, Transparency International UK. Great work, Paul. We're getting to the question of impunity. How can we defeat these networks without severing them from the role played by the lawmakers and politicians that in so many key jurisdictions give them the first anonymity and subsequently impunity that prevents them from their operations being closed down?
Yeah. Well, I believe, as I mentioned before, this is a very unfair fight. On the one hand, you have organized crime that operates, smoothly across borders and crosses frontiers, and on the other hand, we have states that don't quite cooperate with each other. So I think, what's needed in order to really be able to fight global organized crime is we need global institutions. So if we tackle it in fragments, bank by bank, compliance department by compliance department, law enforcement by law enforcement, will be somehow successful. I believe that's the first step, but I think it's all about building global alliances. Without these global alliances, without assembling meaningful networks made of law enforcement, and other actors, civil society and all, I think, our efforts are limited.
Mm-hmm. Who's making the right noises?
I think right now, the criminals are making the most noise. I think they are the most successful. I think, again, because we don't have enough people on our side, and I'm really talking here about bodies, about people that are able to grasp, to understand these global systems. I think we're actually just in a if you want, in an echo chamber, preaching to ourselves like in in this audience here. But I think to be able to break this, we need technology, and we need. What we are developing right now at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project is a software piece that I titled it CPR, Crime Pattern Reporting, which would basically allow identification of patterns, crime patterns, in data sets and in places where we don't know that corruption and organized crime exists, but it would also allow citizens, interested citizens, to investigate. And, a few years back, there was this hype with citizen journalism. And that was complete failure. It was bullshit, because not everybody can be an investigative reporter. Not everybody can be a journalist. Not everybody can write. It's as simple. But everybody can be an investigator. Everybody can investigate a bit of a network. And I think that's where we need to act, to engage more people in research and to enable more people to contribute to the puzzle. So that's much easier than teaching someone how to write, how to investigate, how to fact check, how to do all that we do as reporters. So I think once we have technology on our side and once we have this brain trust, this gathering of brains, sometimes I call it as it's a 100 cores or infinite cores, like a kind of computer, then we'll be able to stop crime.
Okay.
A little bit more.
Okay. Yeah.
Martin Woods, Thomson Reuters. You mentioned the IT piece, and David referenced it at the beginning. The IP addresses. What did you discover about the commonality and the features of that? And moreover, when we leave this room tonight, where can we access the data about the common appearances of the addresses in the UK, the formation agents, the nominees? Are they available to us on your website that we can use them in our own due diligence processes?
So I should first thank you, Martin, because when I started diving into this world in 2010, Martin was an inspiration because he's already worked quite a bit on these massive money laundering schemes, and I was able to access a little bit of his knowledge on this, and that's what directed us towards finding all these laundromats. So thank you for that. On the tech side of how this is run, how those laundromats are run, when I told you we got all this information that was gathered by law enforcement that couldn't continue their work. So they also provided us with the IPs from where these bank accounts were controlled, were handled. And most of these IPs were actually in Kyiv, in Ukraine. And this is something that is ongoing even now. And this is something that the European Commission, the European Parliament doesn't quite get. Is you have countries like Ukraine that want to become members of the EU. And you see that the country has a pro-European government, president, and all that. And you ignore everything else that's going on in the country because they are just pro-European. And this is wrong. This is so utterly wrong. Because if you look beneath this veneer of like pro-Europeanism and all this, you'll find a deeply corrupt society that is run by a few guys, including the president of the country. So this is, without stopping that, bringing, Ukraine into the EU or helping Ukraine, fight anti-corruption, it's completely in vain. So this is what we found. Most of the Russian laundromat was handled out of Ukraine. In fact, most proxies that were used, in these companies set up here in the UK were Ukrainian citizens. After the conflict started in Ukraine, they switched to Russian proxies. This would be people from villages, in Russia or in Ukraine or in other countries in Eastern Europe. So you see all this happening, via, again, IP, via analyzing the data sets. And what we did actually, Martin, was we posted everything online. So we have on our website, which is OCCRP.org, we posted lots of databases, the Azerbaijani laundromat database, the Russian laundromat database. You'll be able to find there the companies involved, the amounts, the bank accounts, and all this. And then we also index lots of the data under another initiative of ours that is called the Investigative Dashboard at investigativedashboard.org. And so what we're trying to do is to post as much as possible online, because we know that we can't handle and we can't expose all this crime and corruption. But what we can do is we can offer the data to the world so that compliance people and due diligence people can do their work.
Yeah. So another question. Yeah, right here.
Hi, Haley Campbell from RUSI. I think it's important we're talking about company service providers, but in the UK and anywhere in the world, you can go into the Companies House website and register a company and have it within 24 hours without any checks being taken out. Is there anything that could be done at that point when registering a company to make it harder for criminals to access the UK system?
I think the answer to that is transparency. And it started in the UK, right? Right now, shareholders should be mentioned in this database. company's house. I think transparency is a partial answer to this. Because of course, through transparency, when criminals used to work a lot with New Zealand companies, you would go to the New Zealand registry of companies, and it would be completely transparent. You could, search by any term. It would be free of charge and all, and then you'd end up with a useless data set, because you'd find that there's someone from Vanuatu, a peasant from Vanuatu, owning the company that opened the bank account with UBS, in Zurich, and was doing business in the UK and in Russia, So transparency. Without, so there's got to be a combination of transparency and intelligence, that can analyze the data in a way that shows context. Without context, you can have all the data in the world and you won't get what's going on. And this is what journalists can give, the context. And you can start with that small, short story, highlighting one corruption case and apply that, to many other instances of corruption. So I think this is what's lacking right now, and this is what we can do. On top of that, it's not about one registry of companies and one country, because what we see is all these sandwiched structures. It's about the formation agent that can set up a company in the UK that is owned by a company in Cyprus, that is owned by a company in Delaware, that is owned by a company there and
that
there.
Has
and
a bank
there.
account in Latvia, etc.
Exactly.
Right. Just very quickly on that, it's a good moment to mention some statistics here. You mentioned Companies House. I think the numbers are there are less than 10 people dealing with the formation of new companies, and there were over 600,000 new companies formed last year. The numbers are mind-boggling. Is that by design? It cannot be done.
Yeah, and
you cannot control that, follow that. You talk about transparency.
Yeah, if you look at these formation agents, they establish shelf companies in the thousands, in the hundreds of thousands sometimes, if you look globally, And investigating all those companies is impossible. But again, as you can, with the banks, you go after the bank that, wires the money initially. You can go after the agent himself or herself, because there are just a handful of them. In each capital city, you have 3 or 4 of those guys, not more than that, because there's secrecy involved, and there's a referral system there where you have these criminals that have access to these formation agents, and then it keeps on growing from there. So it's not a huge task for the financial police to investigate these guys, to identify these guys everywhere in the world, and then to follow their businesses.
We can carry on this conversation over a drink in a minute. Do you enjoy this work?
Very much.
Yeah?
Very much.
Do you the news of yesterday with Daphne, do you walk around in Mexico City, in London, in Riga, wherever, looking over your shoulder the whole time?
I'm afraid lots of times of what's going on around me, and I try to be as cautious as possible, and by design a little bit paranoid. But I think it's exciting work. It's very exciting because for many years now, what I do is I interview criminals who are sentenced to jail, for various crimes, drug trafficking, trafficking in persons, and all this. I went undercover, bought women from traffickers, a few years back, and all. And you always learn from these people, because these people are really the people without borders in their minds and in their so trying to stop them from hurting other people, it's like a mission, it's a way of living in a way.
And finally, what do you want from the people in this room tonight? The compliance people, the regulatory people, the data people, the banks. What should they go away and do, Paul?
I think that especially the people here in this audience, you are all very skilled in investigating financial structures, in following the money, in following the company, in following the bank. I would love if you'd give a little bit of your time to helping an activist or an investigative reporter in assisting someone in putting out there a database that you might have used years ago and that you can publish, or maybe put out a due diligence report that is, again, not bounded by secrecy. I mean, anyway, I mean, the most important is, to create this brain trust and to be able, because it's the only way to deter organized crime and to stop criminals from doing business as usual. And you do have the skill, and I'm not sure if you do have the time, but I think every little help, that you could enroll in stopping these guys from doing business as they do right now would be immensely, immensely helpful.
Okay. I know David's going to say a few closing words, but Paul, Radu, I want to thank you very much indeed for your insight. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Axel, too. I'm between a further conversation and some drinks, so I'm going to make this really short. But what we heard tonight was pretty staggering about the scale of the operation, the complexity, but also how easy it is to abuse the financial systems that we try and protect. I go away tonight wondering, am I feeling more optimistic or more pessimistic? The return on investment, 57,000%, I think you said, of finding the 7 billion, definitely thinks, well, maybe I should be more optimistic about the work of OCCRP. But it's true, if you look at some of the figures, there was a report in 2011 by the UNODC that estimated that only 1% of criminal funds flowing through the system were actually stopped. So when Paul says this is the tip of the iceberg, it really is. And I just imagine if only 1% of the burglaries or the break-ins in my neighborhood were caught and 99 of the 100 criminals were walking around free. It kind of brings it to home. The thing that I struggle with is that 1% is despite hundreds of millions of dollars spent by the banks around here, in the city, around the world, the dollars spent by regulators. And I think we're coming to a realization that it's not as effectively spent as it could be to really chase after the criminals that are doing this. I don't think the banks could argue they have a 57,000% return on investment for the money they spend on compliance. And that makes me think about there must be a better way. As Paul said, don't chase the transaction, chase the bank. And it's getting harder. It came up a number of times and it was clear that criminals don't respect borders. And this isn't a remote problem in Latvia, this is through London. I think you said every case you've looked at has a London connection in some case. I also remember that the Panama Papers maybe should have been renamed the BVI Papers in how they did. So I think there's a real question mark about authorities. And as criminals don't respect borders, I think we worry the fact that borders are going up. It's getting harder to share data across international boundaries. It's getting harder even for one organization to share data on people within their own organization because of the rules and national interests and things that are happening around data privacy. And I think that's going to make this harder, not easier. So, this was an incredible discussion. I want to thank Paul for coming here from Mexico, for his insight, for the work that they do and his bravery, frankly, in doing this. And thank all of you for attending what is the first of a series on financial crime. We hope to see you back in January. We're going to talk about tax evasion and have another conversation about the issues there. But thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Axel.